OK，唔該，好多謝各位咁。
Thank you for coming to this 3 o'clock and not the 4 o'clock media briefing. Well, the 4 o'clock media briefing is hosted by another department. So this is the 3 o'clock PAC press conference. That's Public Accounts Committee press conference. Today, this press conference on the report number 72A. 72A was submitted to Council in July. The first report published in July is about the Labour Department. And then on the 16th of October, the report was tabled at the Council meeting today. This morning, we tabled report number 72A on parking spaces and so on. So the press conference today is on both reports. So there are 2 chapters under the audit report number 72. Now, the member in charge is Mr. Kenneth Leung, the Deputy Chairman. In relation to the report on the Labour Department, the other report on parking spaces, Mr. Lam Cheuk Ting is the member responsible for that. So I will first invite Mr. Leung to take us through the report very briefly, because that report itself is rather straightforward. Good afternoon. As the chairman pointed out, in July, the report was published. At the time, there was no council meeting, so it was several months ago that the report was published. On the whole, the general employment services provided by the Labour Department is, in the view of the committee, not moving with the times. I'll explain briefly why we think so. Let's look at some objective figures. From 2008 to 2017, the unemployment population has dropped by about 120,000 or 3%. But in the same period, people who went to the Labour Department to register for job vacancies, that also dropped by 70.8%. The figure shows that many job seekers did not resort to the services of the Labour Department. Of course, if you want to use the services of the Labour Department, you have to go to their employment centres to register and then use the services. There are 13 employment centres and construction industry recruitment centres. Now, the number of visitors between 2016 and 18, again, there's a drop of 80% in the number of visitors to these centres. So again, that shows that the people do not visit these centres to look for jobs. Instead, they obtain information online. And then services of the Labour Department target the particular groups with higher needs, like the elderly, the middle-aged, the ethnic minorities, and the people with disabilities. But among these different groups, in terms of number of job seekers or the number of successful referral cases, we've seen a drop in the past few years among these groups. So we asked the Labour Department to conduct a comprehensive review on its general employment and recruitment services. Also, it must strengthen its services for those groups, job seekers, special needs, like the elderly, the middle-aged, ethnic minorities, and people with disabilities. And, well, I think that's all by way of introduction. If you have questions, we'll be happy to answer them later. Next, Mr. Lam, please, on the second report. The other report is on the planning, provision and management of public parking spaces. We conducted public hearing. We invited different government departments to come to our hearings. Now, there is a chronic shortage of parking spaces in Hong Kong over a long period, and in fact the matter is getting worse, and the Transport and Housing Bureau is not doing anything. It's now an urgent matter. The government is not acting, and it's only now it's starting to come to realize the problem. Between 2016 and 2006 and 2018, the parking space ratio is 1.32. Well, you know there should be more than one parking space for each car, because you may leave home and you go somewhere and you still need to find somewhere to park your car. In 2006, the ratio was still 1.36, but then by 2018, it's dropped to 1.02. And we expect the ratio to drop below 1. That means there is not a parking space for a private car, and that the cause that leads to further traffic congestion. And then most regrettably, in 2003 and 2014, the government revised the planning standard and guidelines. So there's a further drop in the number of private cars parking spaces in private developments. So because there is shortage of parking spaces, there are now many cars circulating on the road looking for parking spaces, or they just double park. So cars therefore take up road space for a longer period, and leading to worse traffic congestion. So we express grave dismay towards the Transport and Housing Bureau for their inaction. We find that unacceptable. Second point, the Transport Department has not done a proper job in managing public car parks. Again, we find that we express grave dismay, and we find that unacceptable. Now, in 5 public car parks, 13 vehicles were abandoned for a long period of time. The longest period was 11 years, and that vehicle was still taking up a parking space in the public car park. The total foregone public revenue is $3.4 million. Now, we see that there is a serious shortage of parking spaces, but then at Kwai Fong public car park, there's water seepage and there's repair work, and then 75 parking spaces were closed to the public for more than 5 years, and still they did not finish the repair works. Now, if this is a private car park, I would think personally that the repair works would take no longer than 5 weeks, but then in this particular case, the project stretched on for over 5 years. That shows that the government has total disregard to the pressing needs for parking spaces. The government has not done its job in carrying out the repair in a timely manner. As for the Hong Kong e-mobility app launched by the government, I don't think it should be called e-mobility. It should be called difficulties in parking, because if you use that app, it's hard for you to find a parking space. There is too little information on parking spaces in that app. Now, many parking spaces are actually managed by different government departments, but they do not provide information to the revenue department, so the information could be uploaded. So therefore, motorists have difficulties in using this e-mobility app, or in a way in Chinese it's called an easy mobility app, so it's not easy at all. And then for many government car parks, we know that there are charges for electric vehicles, but very often such spaces are taken up by non-EVs. And in some public car parks, no chargers have been installed. So EV owners are not able to find parking spaces with chargers. It is a great inconvenience to them. So on the Hong Kong e-mobility app, the management and planning of EV chargers, again, we express grave dismay. We find the arrangement unacceptable. So from these two reports, you can see that there are 2 government departments and 2 policy bureaus involved. It shows up a governance issue. So they have not made the most of our resources. Instead, they have wasted our resources. The resources could have been deployed to other departments for better uses. say for building schools and so on. Now, this is not an isolated case. In every single report, they never learn from the lessons. So that's why we have to highlight these problems every time. Now, in our every report, we are criticizing the government departments because we hope that other departments will also be alerted to their own mistakes if they have similar practices. But unfortunately, most departments don't even bother to read the reports, and they never bother to improve their governance and the management of their staff members. They think these assets are their own. Now, these assets may be government assets, but actually they're owned by the public. As Mr. Lam said, they would leave a whole floor of parking spaces vacant for 5 years, and that's unacceptable. And we must criticize the department for that. But then we find very often the departments or the bureau may say they agree to the issues raised by the audit commission, and that's it. It's file closed. So why is it that we have to take an effort to do so much more? If they say they've accepted the recommendations, we have to ask them why they've accepted the recommendations and what follow-up work they need to do. And then the public. That's why the Public Accounts Committee has found that our workload is increasing. Now, very often we're not able to finish to present just one report, like we used to do. Now we often have to publish 2 separate reports, and because it takes us a long time to look into the cases, and then our staff are working so hard and they are spending a lot of time working on these reports. So I would like to thank the Audit Commission as well as the colleagues of the PAC under the Electrical Secretariat. Now the floor is open to questions. Yes?
Mr. Lam on the Transport Department. You mentioned how lack of parking space leads to sort of congestion on the road. Should the Transport Department be looking at other solutions like road charging and perhaps reducing the number of cars on our roads in the first place?
We don't make such kind of recommendations to the Transport Department or the Bureau, but we do believe that it is their responsibility to ensure that we Hong Kong people should have sufficient parking spaces. And especially we want to express great dismay, and we find it unacceptable that the Transport Department failed to closely monitor the decreasing parking space ratio for private cars, and to make appropriate planning and to make timely measures to alleviate the shortfall of such parking spaces. And we urge the Bureau and the Transport Department to look into the problem and to make a suggestion to alleviate the problem as soon as possible.
To answer your question, Public Accounts Committees looking for value for money audit to the extent that every dollar spent should be accounted for. Secondly, we would prefer not to touch on policy, but you cannot not take policy into consideration. Your questions on electronic road pricing is a form of traffic management, but ultimately, even the car goes into any direction, they need to be parked. And this whole report is on parking spaces, which is totally inadequate and insufficient. Okay, thank you. Hi. Okay.
Would you please mention your organization? I'm from the RTHK. From the parking space reports, there are vacancy on the multi-stories car park. Are these one-off issues, or is it that the departments fail to utilize their space to the full? But we cannot be reckless in criticizing that the Transport Department is leaving these vacancies systematically. But the problem we found is very serious. In 5 of the car parks, there are 13 vehicles being abandoned, and the most serious case was 11 years in private car parks. In less than 1 month, the abandoned vehicle would be removed. And for the rooftop seepage problem on the Kwai Fong car park, it makes no sense that they took 5 years to carry out the work so that the 75 parking space could not be used. In private car parks, this issue would be solved within a month. So it leads to the doubts whether the management is derelict the duty. From this case, you can see that the attitude and the mechanism in addressing the issue is already problematic. We're not just talking about one department. Many departments have this problem. We just think about this case to show the problem. I would like to supplement. Mr. Lam did not mention it, but in the reports, we can see that when the government is calculating the parking space ratio in a certain district, they also take into account the car park of short-term lease. But if we include the STT car parks as well, when the short-term lease ended, there would be the car park would cease to exist. So if there are 150 parking spaces, the 150 parking spaces would be gone. Like the RTHK reporter just asked, there are no alternative measures. There will be a more pressing demand on parking space, so there would be more serious traffic congestion. The government would not like to see a sharp increase in vehicle numbers, maybe out of environmental concern. But if we do not address the parking space issue, we cannot solve this social problem. Because after all, traffic is a key factor for economic development. It is not just the issue where there are parking spaces, but they are vacant. The most important thing is that the comprehensive planning was ignorant to the social needs and the social issues. Any other questions? Hello, I'm from Now TV. About the automated parking system. In 2002, the government has mentioned the system, and it is only after 16 years was there a pilot study, and it is only in 2021 when it will be implemented in batches. So the government took so long to carry out the study. So is it what caused the lack of parking space? Well, before Mr. Lam answer you, I would like to mention the 73rd auditor's report. The study into redevelopment of public toilets took 7 years. Actually, the toilets are the same, but why did they take 7 years? This is what Mr. Lam will look into. I will give the floor to Mr. Lam. Well, about the underground parking system, the government study is indeed taking an unimaginably long time. In Japan and other places, underground parking is already very advanced, but we are lacking far behind. Well, in dealing with the parking issue, the government is being very ignorant. We can see that the parking space ratio has been dropping so low that the parking space ratio is lower than 1. Well, actually, the government can request private developers for medium and small units to provide more parking space so as to increase provision. But the government has done nothing, and now the auditor has made their findings, and only then does the government know that there are not enough parking space. As I said, the repairing work for a car park took 5 years. Well, if it is a private development project, they would even finish the redevelopment of the project. There is virtually no measure to increase provision of parking space and to alleviate the traffic congestion problem. Well, on the construction of underground parking space, our case is different with other countries. There are many things underground. There are utilities, and there are MTR rails, and because of reclamation, it takes high cost to build underground parking space. Even if we sell these parking space, we cannot cover the cost. But the underground space is not counted into the plot ratio. But if we build the car park above ground, there will not be these geological or plot ratio issues. That's the problem. You can see the government, the department, does not know what they are doing, even within the departments. The vehicles are circulating on the road looking for parking space, and they create a lot of exhaust. Even private cars, their exhaust is very polluting. So, as I said, this is the problem of governance and coordination. The government should strive to create a smart city for Hong Kong citizens. This is a very big issue pending their review.
Oh, hi.
你好啊，都想 follow 翻啱先嗰個，即係16年先至做先導計劃嗰樣嘢嘅。想問政府有冇即係回應過自己點解即係開始呢個先？點解有冇回應過點解開始個先導計劃都要開始即係16年之後先開始咧？即係係咪冇需要啊？定係即係點樣？有冇回應過？
呢個我哋都唔需要問㗎啦。一問嚟問去啊。
Did they ever explain why? Well, I don't think we need to ask because it's not like Frank Chan. He answered my question about the 290,000 people waiting for public housing. The waiting time has been extended from 3 years to 5 years. He said he'll try his best, he'll try his best, he'll try his best. But, you know, if they try their best, they still can't do it. That's why members have to monitor and monitor and monitor the government. You ask them, you know, about all that issues. Yeah, you know, now here in this report we see all the problems as being exposed. And you asked why it took so long, and maybe the revenue officials have changed. They would come up with an explanation. The fact remains that it's taken this long. There's been such a long delay. Well, if I may add, the Commission for Transport said that in 2001, outside of the legislative requirement, the government has came up with guidelines on schemes to facilitate automatic parking system. And then by 2011, there was a surplus in parking spaces. And then in both review, the recommendation was to reduce the supply of parking spaces. That's why they did not see any need for to work on an automatic parking system urgently. Well, actually, I don't know why there was a surplus, because you see the number or the ratio kept dropping over the years, but somehow in the study they concluded there was a surplus of parking spaces. That's why at the time they held back the scheme, so they did not need to look into an automatic parking system. And then in 2014, the Traffic Advisory Committee came up with some recommendations, and then in 2017 they completed their policy review, and finally they decided to go ahead with the pilot study or pilot scheme. Now, I don't know what the basis was for the government to come up with such a conclusion that totally flies in the face of the fact, because the conclusion was that there was a surplus of parking spaces. That is just simply impossible. You know, the government has relaxed requirement for obtaining private vehicle license, but then all along the government has been lowering the ratio of parking spaces in private development. So of course, then there are fewer parking spaces, but then there's an increasing number of vehicles. So they still don't see a need to build it. Well, no, they say that there is no incentive to build the system. But now, anyway, we see that there is an increasingly tight supply of parking spaces, because you see prices of parking spaces have been going up. But then the conclusion is that there's a surplus, so that's totally preposterous. I think with parking spaces is about calculation. We always say that there are not enough berthing spaces for ships, but then they always say that there are enough spaces in the typhoon shelters. Maybe they just take the total number of cars in Hong Kong and divide that by the number of parking spaces, and so they get a ratio. But then, you know, it depends on the location of parking spaces. Maybe in remote locations, there are plenty of parking spaces. Now, originally the ratio was 1.32, now it's 1.03, and so there's still a surplus of 0.03. Maybe that kind of calculation has affected their judgment, and probably they did not foresee the accelerated increase in the growth of vehicles. But anyway, I don't think the SL government officials have done their best. They could have done better, as we can see from this case. You see what civil servants are like. You know, for every civil servant, you know, he or she is paid the same, so whatever he does. And there's no mechanism to fire people. In other report, in other committees, we have found some government officials that have made mistakes with calculation. At the end, at most, they would just get a warning, or maybe they will just stay on until they get transferred, or they go on retirement. So there's no way to take them to task. So I think the government has to consider how they could mobilize officials, especially in key positions, or even for those at the directorate level. How do we mobilize them? Now, another question, one point is totally relevant. If you look at the growth in the vehicle fleet compared to the economic ups and downs we've experienced in the past 20 years in Hong Kong, and you can think about that, and when did they carry out the consultant's report? Very often the consultant would report what you want them to report, but you could see actually when there was an economic downturn, there would be fewer new vehicles. But when you're doing city planning, you don't just look at the immediate present. You have to look at future developments. Your colleague asked about electronic road pricing. There is a philosophy about this scheme. But at the same time, there are sufficient car parking spaces, as in the case of Singapore, while they roll out the ERP. Now, the parking space ratio is almost 1, and that's really dangerous. That means when a car leaves home, there won't be a parking space for that car at all. Apple Daily, one comment. I'd like to ask about abandoned vehicles. Now, there have always been cases of abandoned vehicles. And in the report, the Transport Department said that it would direct the contractor to take action. Now, if a contractor has not dealt with abandoned vehicles for many years, shouldn't the contractor be penalized? Say, shouldn't a fine be slapped on the contractor? Of course, the contractor should be held responsible, but at the same time, the Transport Department must also show the responsibility because it has the duty to monitor the performance of contractors. There's no way the department could allow abandoned vehicles to take up public government's parking spaces for as long as 11 years without paying any rent. That is totally outrageous. In the public hearings, we asked the Transport Department and contractors to be taken to task for that. I understand a relevant warning has been issued. Another point is about, another point was abandoned vehicles. Also depends on the interpretation of the police and other departments on the legal requirement. I think that there was a long time when the two departments were locked in arguments. It's totally uncalled for. And both departments have promised in a report that they would try to improve communication in future. So there won't be abandoned vehicles taking up public parking spaces for an unduly long period. Any questions on employment service? No? Of course, we know we have a low unemployment rate now. And very often when people switch to a different job, they don't approach the Labour Department. But as the Deputy Chairman pointed out, when there is not a strong demand for the service, then this is the time for the Labour Department to review its work as a whole. Do they still need so many staff members given the workload? And what about those who require assistance, as the Deputy Chairman pointed out? The department never considered how it should serve its target groups, but that is important. Anyway, for report number 73, there are 10 chapters. We will take up chapter 1, planning and management of public toilets. And then we'll also take up the chapter on Hong Kong Productivity Council, the Hong Kong Productivity Council. So these 2 chapters, we will conduct public hearings. As for the other 8 chapters, we're still considering whether we'll take up any of them. The first one, the first chapter, public toilet, Ms. Tanya Chen is responsible for that, and for chapter 3, the Deputy Chairman is responsible for that. Of course, other members will also look at other reports or chapters to see if there's need for public hearings. Thank you.
唔該。
唔該晒。